Some weeks I can stand on my own. Some weeks the words need a little bit more prompting, I guess. A little bit more, reminding. Some weeks I can stand on my own. Some weeks, ladies and gentlemen, I need a prop. Sometimes I need a literal prop. Something to lean on to hold me up. The second scripture reading continues where we were at in the 14th chapter of the book of Exodus, picking up with the 21st verse. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land. The waters were divided. The Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their left, their right, and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went into the sea after them. All of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and chariot drivers. At the morning watch, the Lord in the pillar of fire and cloud looked down upon the Egyptian army and threw the Egyptian army into panic. He clogged their chariot wheels so that they turned with difficulty. The Egyptians said, "Let us flee from the Israelites, for the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots and chariot drivers." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at dawn the sea returned to its normal depth. As the Egyptians fled before it, the Lord tossed the Egyptians into the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the chariot drivers. The entire army of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea, not one of them remained. But the Israelites walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. May God continue to bless the experiences of Scripture for us on this day. May it guide the meditations of our hearts and the words of my lips. There are some things in Scripture that are deeply troubling. They are hard to experience. They are hard to preach. Even as Scripture was being written and codified and collected into what we would call the Bible, rabbis wrestled with what happened to the Egyptian army. And they offered insight, texts speaking of God grieving the death of the Egyptians. For they too were children of the living God. I do not know why or what made Pharaoh's heart hardened outside of what Scripture says. I don't know if it was there to support the belief that God is in absolute control, but what I do read from that particular part of the text is this idea that tyrannical grasping at power and economies that are built upon enslaved and impoverished labor, economies that are built upon exploitation and dehumanization, those things do not end well. But the text isn't only about the destruction of Pharaoh's army. The words in the text highlight a birth, a baptism, a creation and a destruction event here at the sea. The conflict between creation and destruction is witnessed for us in two different Hebrew words in the text. They're both used to describe dry land. One is the word that we find quite often, and it's especially used in connection of the 7 days of creation, when God's Spirit moved across the deep, when God separated waters from waters, when God gathered the waters up and created dry land. That word, dry land, that creative term, God knows there are people today that could use some dry land. The other word that is there in that text that is so troubling for us also describes dry land. It is the word that's used to describe the land that the people Israel walked on there at the end of the reading as they crossed through between the waters that had been separated in this new creation event. And that word for dry land describes a wasteland, a ruin, the aftermath of war. In recording the text, two words show this creative and this destructive process. This dry land that comes from the water being hemmed in, and this dry land that is connected with the destruction, the troubling destruction. And I said it was a birthday. It's a birth story. It's the birth of the people Israel because they come out of this creative, destructive dichotomy as the people Israel. Because up to this moment, they really weren't yet. They were a really big family. They were the family that had sought shelter in Egypt generations before. They were the family that came from Abraham and Sarah. They were the family that, after generations of enslavement, a family that is now a great multitude and is on the march. And that enslavement was done away with in the stroke of a pen. A proclamation saying you are now free. Snap fingers, world's changed for the people. They're on their way to the promised land, the land that was promised to Abraham and Sarah way back in the book of Genesis, which was only a couple Sundays ago. We've all slept since then. But Scripture tells us that Pharaoh, upon further review, it turns out that you did have, upon further review, long before the NFL, upon further review, realizes that when he let the people go, they actually had the audacity to leave. Imagine that, giving a person the freedom to go, and then they choose to actually go. I will give this note to any and all who are considering going to college, and your parents are having a hard time letting you go. I looked at schools in Alaska, having grown up in Baltimore. So when I went to a school in Ohio, Mom was thrilled to let me go. Stroke of a pen changed my life by letting me into a school, and the stroke of a pen changed the world for the people of Israel, and then they had the chutzpah to actually go out and try and change their world. And Pharaoh sat on his throne and said to himself, "Remember, we made an agreement when you went away. Now you're making me mad remember, despite our estrangement, I'm your man. You'll be back, soon you'll see. You'll remember you belong to me. You'll be back, time will tell. You'll remember that I served you well. So Pharaoh sent his armies. He dispatched the most fearsome weapon in all of the ancient Eastern Mediterranean world, and that is the chariot. Limited only by the imagination of the soldiers that were running it and the terrain that they were on. Ever wonder why the people of Israel settle in the mountains? Chariots don't go in mountains very well. And so there they are, the people of Israel. They have been given freedom. They have been released from the bonds, from the strawless brick making and everything else that was wrong with being enslaved, and they were set free, and then challenges emerge. Imagine that. Challenges rising up. Every time there is a change in life, there seems to be a challenge to go with it. We get into a new school year, and the work is harder. We leave home, and there are challenges that arise. We get hired into our first job or into a new job, and there are challenges that crop up. We retire, and we find that there are challenges and adjustments that must be made. Great challenges sometimes. Challenges that make us question our decisions. And we think to ourselves, it sure would be a lot better if I could just go back to the way it was. If I could just go back to Egypt in my strawless brick making. Challenges that make us question our leadership. Did you really bring us out here just to die? Challenges that make us question the very will of God itself. God, I will not move from this place until you tell me what it is you're doing here. Well, wait, are those chariots? And then we are moved. We are moved by and to faith despite or because of the challenges. We are brought up from the waters despite and because of the challenges. We say, here I am to God, despite or because of the challenges. We are set free from the bonds and snares that we find ourselves wrapped in, despite or perhaps because of the challenges. I don't know. But what does seem to be the case is that whenever the freedom is finally given, the freeing of the body, the mind doesn't always follow. And if we free the mind, the heart doesn't always fall in line. And if we free the heart, the spirit might tarry a little bit longer. And that order is not fixed, by the way. We are freed and challenges arise. And the people of Israel act just like human beings. Imagine that. People in Scripture acting like human beings. Imagine us acting just like human beings. People in Scripture acting like people today. They act like churches and other communities of faith that have been given freedom and a path to go on. Here's a hint. There's chariots behind you. And then challenges arise. And we say we want to go back. We question our leadership. We question God. It would just be easier to go back. And then we find, as the story shows, that the God of creation is already at work. A lifeline tossed out by the sea. God is already at work, bringing them through the waters from the life in Egypt that has been destroyed, into the new life. They cross the threshold that is the sea. The waters change. You can't go back the way you came once you go through them. At the sea, the people of Israel witness God with us. Now, if they knew what was in store on the other side, if we knew what was going to happen tomorrow, we might take our chances with the chariots. Some of the people might have turned back and said, Pharaoh, I'm sorry. Because it can seem, or it can actually be in some ways, easier to stay with the devil we know oh so well instead of stepping out with the God we are getting acquainted with. It's easier to be propped up and to lean on. Perhaps there were some in that group, in that people Israel, who are already rewriting the history of things in their hearts and in their minds, because history can be like that. We can rewrite it. And they convince themselves that Egypt really did seem like the better option. And perhaps we still do that today, as we stand by the sea. Going back seems like a better option. Perhaps here by the sea, as we are leaning on what was, the things that prop us up at least, not the things of God. Perhaps here by the sea, we wrestle with the consequences, with the prospects and the realities, the challenges of being honest to God, free. With the stroke of a pen, with the immersion in the water, with the crossing on dry land, the thing that we have leaned on to identify us for so long is gone. We are left standing on our own. But God is already here and already at work. God is already present in the challenges and through the challenges. God is present in that call to be still and in that command to move through the natural wonders and miracles in an unknown direction, leaving behind the things that are ultimately destroyed, and heading into a land that is promised, a realm of God that has come so wonderfully, dangerously near. Thanks be to God. Amen.